In the 1950s, you're going to see massive deportation programs taking place in the United States. We'll talk about a couple of examples. One, Operation Wetback in 1954. This was a deportation campaign that took place nationwide, heavily focused on California and Texas. Labor unions played a role in pushing for Operation Wetback. Remember, labor unions were against illegal immigrants coming into the United States because they felt that they were taking Americans' jobs. And so you have labor unions pushing for deportation. And finally, the U.S. government will move forward with this program. In Operation Wetback, 1 million Mexicans were deported back to Mexico, right? So it's a massive deportation program. Another more localized deportation campaign was Operation Terror. Operation Terror is happening around the same time as Operation Wetback, and this is more focused on the city of Los Angeles, right, instead of being a nationwide campaign. Operation Terror, though, had some illegal aspects to it. For one, there were no search warrants involved, and so basically you have immigration agents just breaking into people's houses and businesses without any kind of search warrant and gathering up people who they believed were illegal aliens. There were no legal hearings involved in any of these cases, and people who were deported were never given any type of legal counsel. And so there were a number of aspects of Operation Terror that were pretty much illegal. Families were broken up during this time, as normally happens with deportations, where you have members of the family who are deported, while those who are American citizens are left behind. Now, employers actually took advantage of these massive deportation campaigns. How so? Well, employers continued to bring in undocumented workers and hire them, particularly in the farming industry. And they're hiring them, and they're using these deportation campaigns as a threat to try to keep undocumented workers from organizing and fighting for their rights. Okay, so basically they're saying, look at what happened. This could happen to you. All I got to do is call immigration, and so this scares undocumented workers from trying to organize or become part of unions. All right, so in that way, employers are using the deportations to their advantage. Some Mexican American organizations actually supported these deportation campaigns. Some examples in Texas of this is the GI Forum, which we talked about earlier, and LULAC. LULAC as well. Remember, we were talking about how LULAC was trying to distance themselves from Mexican immigrants, trying to maintain the rights that Mexican Americans had been fighting for. You may remember that we were talking about LULAC and how they had a strategy to change the identification of Mexican Americans to have them be known as Latin Americans or as Caucasians. We'll see a little bit more of that going on during this time, especially surrounding the issue of school segregation. Now in Texas, segregation had been going on, but it wasn't enforced by law. Right? There were no laws in Texas that said that Mexicans were supposed to be segregated from whites in public facilities, right? But it was part of the normal custom in Texas, right? It's the way that things had been in Texas, right? It became entrenched in the culture of Texas. And so organizations like LULAC were trying to fight back against segregation, particularly school segregation. And so one of the strategies that they used was referring to Mexican Americans as being, the other white. Okay, they're trying to argue that Mexican Americans are white, right? Like going back to their Spanish heritage. And so this argument was trying to bring about equality for Mexican Americans, saying that yes, they're the other white, and there's no reason why Mexican Americans couldn't go to the same schools as white children, right? Because they're white as well. They're just, the other white. And so you would see this issue of the other white have an effect on school desegregation. And so the case of Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka was a landmark case that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And ultimately the Supreme Court found that segregation was illegal in schools. And so this court case has a lot of implications. It's supposed to lead to desegregation in schools, right? It's supposed to lead to integration. So basically African Americans and other minority groups are supposed to be integrated into white schools because because of this ruling related to Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, all right? But you're going to see a lot of opposition to the enforcement of integration, the enforcement of this ruling by the Supreme Court, right? So there's a lot of opposition. There's many Anglo-Americans who are against this, particularly in the South, all right? And so how would they try to get around this decision of Brown versus Board of Education? Well, in a number of different ways. One of them is they would redesign the school districts, right? They would create new school districts so that schools would stay segregated, right? Normally, you go to a school based on where you live, right? The school, if you're in a certain school district, if you live there in that district, then that's the school that you go to, right? And so if towns are segregated and you know you have Mexicans and Mexican Americans living in one part of town, well, of course they're going to have to go to the school that, whose district they live in. Right, and so they created. And so in Texas, you're going to see the creation of new school districts so that schools would stay segregated. You would also see court cases trying to appeal the decision of Brown versus Board of Education, right? So there'd be a number of court cases trying to fight against desegregation. Now, the other white strategy that we talked about earlier that was promoted by LULAC, this idea that Mexican Americans were also white, this strategy would be used actually against integration and desegregation, right? So you would have supporters of segregation promoting the idea that African Americans should be integrated into Mexican American schools, right? Because they're white schools. Right? You see how that's being used? And so you would have a number of African Americans being integrated not into Anglo-American schools, but into Mexican American schools because they were considered white schools, using that other white strategy against the integration of African Americans into white schools. All right. Also, during this time, you would have something called the Southern Manifesto coming about. And the Southern Manifesto basically was a written document that was arguing against desegregation. You had a number of congressmen, mostly from the South, who were supporting the Southern Manifesto. And basically, the manifesto was saying that desegregation was unconstitutional, that the federal government did not have the right to get involved in this issue because it was a states' rights issue. And so this is an argument being put forth by Southern politicians and other Southerners who are against desegregation.